If you've been with us over the last several weeks, you know that we've been in a series all about relationships called Walking with Others, and we've been talking about what it means to really navigate relationships well. And we've kind of gone from this baseline understanding that Solomon tells us in the book of Proverbs that when you walk with the wise, you become wise, that who you do life with, who you surround yourself with actually matters. And kind of our thesis for this whole series has been this idea that relationships are one of the primary ways that God blesses us, that He grows us, that He fortifies our faith. And so relationships are a big deal because it's not just about a better social calendar or a better marriage or being a better parent. Those are great byproducts. But at the end of the day, relationships are really foundational for life, that the quality of our relationships is going to determine the quality of our lives. And so we've talked about what it means to really surround ourselves with the right kind of people in the right seasons. And we've talked about what it looks like to really have true friendships and how friendships are kind of the foundation for all the relationships that we have in our lives. And then last week, we talked about what it would look like to have a biblical vision and a biblical understanding of marriage. And I want to encourage you, if you weren't here last week, if you missed last week's message, I want to encourage you, go to the podcast, go to YouTube, listen to last week's message, because I think now more than ever, we need a solid biblical foundation of what marriage is. We need a solid biblical foundation of what it means to be in a relationship that is holy and honorable before God. And if you have your Bibles this morning, you can turn to the book of Song of Solomon, chapter 2, and then maybe you can hold your spot there. And we're going to also spend some time in Matthew chapter 26 today. Song of Solomon 2 and Matthew chapter 26. And Song of Solomon says this in chapter 2, beginning in verse 10, says, "My beloved spoke and said to me, 'Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me. See, the winter is past, the rains are over and gone, flowers appear on the earth. The season of singing has come, the cooing of doves is heard in our land.'" The man is in love. The man is poetic. He's dropping he's in his poet era in this moment. And he goes on in verse 15 to say, "Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in full bloom." All throughout this series, we've really turned to the wisdom of Solomon, because Solomon, who is known as one of the wisest men to ever live on earth, also is someone that frequently speaks of relationship and how to navigate wise relationships. He's the one that said, "Walk with the wise and become wise." He's the one that said the righteous choose their friends wisely. And in the book of Song of Solomon, we get really kind of like a TV, mature, rated version of a relationship between a man and a woman. And here Solomon is using this imagery of a garden or a vineyard to represent this relationship. And he says in these verses, he says that it is a garden that has been through the winter. It's a garden that has been through the rains. He's trying to communicate to us that this is a relationship that has weathered some seasons. This is a relationship that's been through the winter. It's a relationship that's been through the rain. It's weathered some things that could have taken it out, but it's weathered those things. And he's saying now it's bountiful, it's beautiful, it's bearing fruit. This is a beautiful place for us to kind of conclude our series on relationships, because Solomon is really painting a picture of what we want from our relationships, which is not just relationships that are kind of stagnant and back burner, but relationships that are actually bearing fruit in our lives. Relationships that are actually bringing forth some purpose in our lives. And he's saying, man, we have this garden that is bearing fruit. It's grown and it's beautiful and it's seen some things. Anybody in a relationship or been in a relationship that has seen some things? Like you have been through some seasons in your relationship. And then he says this, he says, "Catch for us the little foxes." Now, when Solomon talks about little foxes, it would have been understood at this time that in vineyards, there were literal little foxes that would try to get into vineyards, and they would take out the crop of the vineyard, not by eating the fruit and not by destroying the plants, but by digging down and actually gnawing at the roots of the plants. And what a perfect picture of what so often takes out our relationships. What a perfect picture of what so often destroys some of the greatest relationships in our lives. I would say it this way, like some of our relationships maybe have moments where it seems like there's just this explosive moment and man, it's like that relationship just explodes. But I would say more often than not, our relationships don't explode, they just erode. Over time, people or things just kind of seep in and begin to gnaw at the roots of our relationships. And the greatest threat to our relationships is not always another storm. Solomon's saying, we weathered the storms. Now we have to watch out for the little things. And I want to say that to you today. Like if you have some relationships in your life, if you're blessed with relationships in your life that are fruitful, if you're blessed to be surrounded by people or to be in a marriage or in a relationship that man, God is really just using in your life to grow you and to mature you and to fortify your faith and to support you. The greatest danger isn't necessarily some big, massive blow up. Often the greatest danger is just the little things that can come in and gnaw and erode at our relationships. And there are so many issues that can sneak in that way. And so today, the title of my message is Eggshells and Landmines. Because when you're navigating relationships, anybody ever been in a season, don't raise your hand just in case someone's beside you. But anybody ever navigated a season with somebody where it felt like you were maybe walking on eggshells? Anybody ever navigated a season where you didn't realize it, but it felt like you walked into a minefield and you stepped on something that just exploded the whole relationship? Like you brought up the topic, you instigated the conversation, whatever it might be. This one I want an actual show of hands on. Anybody in the room at any level, maybe it's been in your marriage, maybe it's been in a friendship or in a work relationship, at some point or another, we'll make it real broad so we're not looking at anybody specific. At some point or another, you have navigated some relational tension. I'll wait if you don't have your hand up. We all, at some point or another, navigate relational friction. And here's the reality. Relationships will always be a target of the enemy because relationships are a source of unity. And Scripture is really clear about the power of unity. Scripture is really clear. The Bible says that where there is unity, God actually commands a blessing. That's why we say that relationships are one of the ways that God blesses us, because Scripture tells us that when we are unified in relationships, that God commands a blessing. So as long as there is blessing and there is growth and there is spiritual maturity tied to the unity within our relationships, those relationships will be a target for the enemy. And a lot of us are pretty good at looking out for the big landmine moments, but we often don't realize the small things that can seep into our relationships, and they go unaddressed over time. They go unacknowledged over time. And what was a little fox that didn't seem like much harm has gnawed at the roots and destroyed what was once healthy. Healthy relationships do not stay healthy automatically. Healthy relationships require attention. They require us to be willing to deal with issues. And this is what we have to recognize. Like human relationships, I promise you, are complex enough without additional obstacles. They're complex enough without unsaid things that we have to navigate. And so healthy relationships, they require presence and attention. And my concern for a lot of us today is that we are spending so much time ignoring or navigating relational tension that we actually cannot be present in our lives. That we simply can't show up for the people that we need to show up for because we're navigating so much unacknowledged and unaddressed relational tension. And I think when it comes to the life of Jesus, who is the perfect example of life in so many ways that we could look at, but I think we often have a clear understanding and this clear idea of supernatural Jesus. Like we have a clear visual and a clear understanding of like water into wine Jesus. We have a clear visual and a clear understanding of raising the dead Jesus, of feeding the 5,000 Jesus, of turning water into wine Jesus. I think we often have a pretty clear picture of supernatural Jesus, but sometimes within that picture of supernatural Jesus, I think we miss relational Jesus. And not just relational Jesus that wants to have a relationship with you and me, but relational Jesus who walked the earth and had actual relationships with actual humans on his time on earth. Actual Jesus who actually had to deal with other human beings who also had free will and made decisions, who did not dictate their every single action, but had to actually manage interpersonal relationships. Actual Jesus who was at weddings celebrating with those who were celebrating, who was at tombs grieving with those who grieved. Actual relational Jesus who wept over the loss of a close friend. Jesus all throughout Scripture is relational, and so often we apply that to our own lives. Like, yeah, he's relational, so he wants to have a relationship with you and me. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that he was relational and had actual people that he walked through relationship on earth with. And that we can look to that as an example. Because Jesus' relationships on earth were not perfect. Which is telling, because he was perfect. He did everything right. Have you ever felt like you did everything right in a relationship and it still went sideways? Like, have you ever felt like you did everything you possibly could in a relationship and it still didn't go the way that you wanted to go? You did everything you thought you could do, made every right step. You sought counsel. You did everything you thought you could do to do the relationship right, and somehow it still falls apart. Listen, be encouraged that Jesus, who is literally perfect, literally walked a sinless and blameless life, still had relationships that went south. Still had relationships that did not see the outcome in the moment that even he would have desired in that moment. And we see in the last kind of hours of Jesus' life before he goes to the cross, this very intense time of anguish and this very intense time where the weight of the world is piling in on him. We see that he's also navigating very, very real relational tension. And not relational tension in like toxic people that are anti the vision and the message of Jesus. He faces very real relational tension in the people that are closest to him. He faces relational tension in the people that are on mission with him. He faces relational tension from the people that he has invested in most, that he has spent the most time in. See, I think often when we approach relationships and we come on some sort of relational tension, the way we write off the tension is by writing off the person. And so we say, look, I mean, they're just toxic. They're just not worth my time. They're just not worth investing in. And listen, we can have a conversation about how, yes, there are some relationships that you need to separate from and you need to put some distance in. But today what I want to talk about is the fact that I think too often we give up on relationships too early. That too often there are relationships that God has placed in our life for our growth and our benefit and our spiritual development, that when things get difficult and when there is tension and when we don't know exactly how to navigate the season that we are in, instead of working to resolve and reconcile, we walk away. And we have this beautiful picture of these last hours of Jesus' life and how he faced this relational tension from the people who were closest to him. In Matthew chapter 26, beginning in verse 31, Jesus has gathered his disciples around the table, knowing that the next day he's going to the cross. And it says, he told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." Over the next couple of minutes, I want to walk you through 4 ways that I see Jesus navigating 4 very typical instigators of relational tension in our lives, and then give you some steps towards reconciliation. And here we see the first one in this conversation with Peter. Jesus encounters something that so often comes into play in our relationships, and it's defensiveness. I love Peter's boldness in this moment. I love that in this moment, Peter is like, listen, not me. Like, God, Jesus, all of these other fools may walk away from you, but let me tell you something. I am strong. If I have to die with you, I will die with you, but I will not walk away from you, and I will not deny you. See, so often in relationships, we talk about the importance of communication. Communication is extremely important in relationships. Clear communication is vital for relationships. But this illustrates something that I don't think we always comprehend when it comes to relationships, is that good, clear, healthy communication has to be both delivered and received well. It's one thing just to learn to deliver clear, honest, open communication. It's another thing to actually receive clear, open, and honest communication. Because see, in this moment, Jesus is not a bad communicator. Jesus is not an unclear communicator. Jesus clearly communicates what he sees happening in this moment. There is not a lack of clarity. Peter just refuses to accept what Jesus is saying. It's not a miscommunication, it's unreceived communication. It's not that Peter doesn't hear what Jesus is saying, it's that he's not listening to what Jesus is saying. And so often in our relationships, we sometimes hear what someone is saying, but we don't actually listen to what they're saying. And this plays itself out in our lives. I mean, for some of you, you may have friends who at some point or another in your life have come to you and they've just very honestly assessed something in your life and said, hey, listen, I just want to submit to you that I see this in your life and it concerns me. I see this pattern, I see this habit, I see that when you get with this certain group of people, man, I see kind of a disparity between who I know you wanna be and the way that you act and the things that you do, and I'm just pointing this out to you. And instead of actually hearing what they're saying, instead of actually listening and receiving what they are saying, we get defensive and dismissive. Like maybe for some of us who are married, our spouses come to us and they say, listen, this is not an accusation, but I'm just concerned about some of the relationships that I'm seeing develop in your life and where they are taking you. And how do we respond? Oh, you know me. You know nothing would ever happen to me. You know I can handle myself. This is essentially what Peter is saying in this moment. And what's true of him is so often true of us. Peter is sincere. He's just not self-aware. He sincerely believes what he's saying. He sincerely believes, man, I will never, ever deny you. I will never walk away from you. He's sincere. He's not being evil in this moment. He's just emotional. And sometimes our first response is an emotional response of defense and of dismissing, rather than actually assessing what's being said, rather than actually being willing to acknowledge that maybe there is some truth in someone's assessment of what's going on in our lives. And defensiveness puts us in a position of fighting for ourselves and our reputation rather than fighting for the relationship. And when we're in relationship with somebody, we should never really find ourselves fighting against each other. We should be fighting for the relationship together. We should be fighting together for the relationship. And I think this defensive, dismissive posture mostly creeps in situations like Peter is experiencing here, where nothing has actually happened. There's nothing to actually accuse him of. He has not yet denied Jesus. We get defensive and we get dismissive often when someone is pointing out a pattern that they're seeing of what it may lead to. Because we can kind of stand on this ground of, man, you know me, you know nothing would ever happen. Can I just submit to you this morning that in a healthy relationship, we need to be willing to slow down and to listen to what people are speaking into our lives. We need to be willing to slow down and assess if there is truth in what's being said about the situation that we're in, because ultimately, when we get defensive, it leads to dishonesty in relationships. Because I can tell you this, if you get defensive often enough in a relationship, eventually the other person just quits communicating honestly with you. If they know that every time they point something out, if they know that every time there's a concern, you're just going to dismiss everything they say, eventually defensiveness begins to gnaw at the root of communication because it makes us feel as though we cannot be honest. We have to be willing to step back, and we have to be willing to slow down, and we have to be willing to not just hear, but to listen to what is being said and not to react purely out of emotion, but to respond, to acknowledge where there may be truth in what's being said. And as if that moment is not enough, like it just seems like this whole progression of Matthew chapter 26, Jesus is dealing with one relational issue after another. And have you ever felt like that is your life? Like, have you ever felt like it's not just one relational issue at a time? It feels like every relationship in your life in some form or another is being attacked. Every relationship in your life has some form of resistance in it. And there's this moment where after dinner, Jesus knows he's going to the cross. And so he invites not all of the disciples, but just 3 of his closest friends to join him in prayer. And he's in anguish, and he invites them into this moment of prayer in the garden. And it says this in Matthew chapter 26, verse 40. It says, he returned to the disciples and found them sleeping. Could you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. And when he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed a third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Jesus is in this critical moment of anguish and this critical moment of despair. And these disciples do something that I think so often affects our relationships, and I just simply call it missing the moment. They missed the moment. Jesus invited them into this moment of vulnerability. He invited them into this moment that he was in anguish and he was in pain, and they simply missed the moment. We have these moments in our lives where we want the moment to be matched. Like we want the level of our friends' empathy and the level of our friends' understanding and the level of their excitement to match the experience that we are walking through, and they simply don't recognize the weight. And I want to encourage you, it's okay in those times to be frustrated. Like I think even in the life of Jesus, we see a level of frustration in this moment where he's like, man, 3 times, can you not stay with me? But the reality is that they're invited into this sacred moment, and they miss it not because they are malicious, but because they are distracted and tired. And I think sometimes we just forget that the people we're in relationship with are human just like we are. Like we've all missed it a time or two. We've all not recognized the significance or the weight of a moment. We've all moved past a moment too quickly. And many relational wounds don't come from intentional cruelty. They come from inattention. They come from not recognizing the moment that we are in. We need presence and empathy and urgency, and we don't get it from the people closest to us, or we don't give it to the people closest to us. But the danger is this: if we repeatedly miss the moments of the people around us, eventually they will quit inviting us into them. Like, have you ever had that friend that you just invited them and invited them and invited them and invited them to join you and to participate with you in things, and they never showed up? And what do? You eventually just quit inviting them. You eventually think that the lack of presence, that their lack of initiative to actually join and to actually say yes means that they don't care. And so often we will just quit inviting people in. So if defensiveness erodes honesty in a relationship, missing the moment will erode vulnerability in a relationship. It'll gnaw at the root of our desire and our willingness to invite people into relationship. And I would say these first 2 things that that Jesus kind of faces in this moment, this defensive response from Peter and this missing the moment from the three. These are kind of those eggshell moments. These are kind of those moments that man, you just kind of unaddressed, you have to navigate around them. But how many of you know if you have enough relationships with enough unaddressed issues in your life, you find yourself constantly managing the eggshells that you're trying to walk around? Like, I don't know about you, but have you ever found yourself in one of those seasons where you're having to assess, like, man, I don't really know if I want to go hang out with this group of people because honestly, so-and-so is going to be there. And we kind of have this thing that we haven't really talked about and we haven't really worked out. So I don't really know if I can go there. But then there's this thing over here and I can't really go to that either because there's this other person that I kind of have this thing that we haven't really had the conversation yet. And next thing you know, you find yourself more and more isolated because there are more and more eggshell moments that you're having to navigate around. And the Bible talks about walking with the wise. It is really difficult to walk when you're constantly navigating eggshells. And I would say these are kind of eggshell moments, but there are also those deep wound moments in relationship that I would kind of refer to as landmine moments where the level of disappointment, the level of just feeling blindsided by decisions that were made is greater than just kind of a baseline disappointment. And Jesus experiences those moments as well in these last moments before he goes to the cross. In verse 47, it says, while he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus replied, do what you came for, friend. And in this moment, Jesus experiences the betrayal of a close friend. He experiences betrayal. And betrayal is one of those relational moments that is so difficult to navigate because this is not a lack of self-awareness. This is not inattention. This is intentional, planned, conscious betrayal. Judas, if you know the story, has conspired with another group of people who is against Jesus to actually bring him down. And one of the most difficult relational obstacles to navigate is betrayal because as much as you would like to, you cannot control the actions of other people. All you can do is control your response. And I think that's where Jesus gives us this beautiful insight. As his betrayer comes, Jesus still calls him friend. He says, friend, do what you have come to do. I don't know if I would call him friend in that moment. I don't know if the words that came out of my mouth would be so gracious in that moment, but I think it's beautiful because it illustrates that Jesus was giving Judas the benefit of the doubt right up until the very moment. Right up until the very moment, he was not defining him by his worst moment. He was not identifying him by his worst moment. I think it's interesting that Matthew, who actually writes this gospel, Matthew calls him a betrayer, but Jesus calls him friend. And I love that because Matthew's more like me. He looks back on this story and he's like, oh, I know what to name this guy. This guy is the betrayer. And by the way, side note, sometimes your friends will have a harder time with people that betray you than you will. Matthew looks back on the situation and says, betrayer. And Jesus says, do what you came to do, friend. See, often we love to reduce people to their worst moment, to reduce people to their worst decision. And betrayal ultimately erodes and gnaws at the root of trust in our relationships. It is hard to come out on the other side of betrayal and trust other people. And so we find ourselves trusting less and less people. And then in verse 56, kind of concludes the story with this line. It says, then all the disciples deserted him and fled. All of the disciples fled. Just before his worst moment, Jesus experiences abandonment. And I hope that you've never experienced this, but the reality is sometimes we walk through seasons of life that feel like our entire relational structure or network is being shaken or removed out from under us. This is not just the betrayal of Judas. This is not just the denial of Peter. It says all of the ones that he had invested in, all of the ones that he had sat around a table with the night before, all of the ones who had heard his sermons and seen him work miracles, all of the ones who had chosen to give their lives to him, abandon him in this moment. And abandonment teaches us not to need others too much. When we feel as though we've been abandoned, we decide that we just don't need others. We don't need to surround ourselves in others. Don't rely on others too much. Don't count on others too much. Don't invest in others too much. See, Jesus experienced every relational obstacle that you could experience in these final moments of his life. But what I love is that he chooses in these moments, he chooses to still love, he chooses to restore, he chooses to re-invite people back into his life. And again, yes, there are some relationships in your life that may need some distance. There are some relationships in your life you may need to sever from. But can I tell you, we give up on relationships too early. In seasons of hardship, we give up on relationships too early. And so I just want to quickly give you 3 steps that we can take of reconciliation that we see in Jesus just after this story when he's risen from the dead. I'm going to invite the worship team to join me. But the first is this: we can make the first move. We can make the first move. John 20, verse 19 says, on the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the door locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them. He came to them. It would have been easy for him to say, the rumors of my resurrection are rampant. They should be hearing about it. They will come and find me. They will come to me. But instead, Jesus goes to them. So often we wait for the other person. We wait for the apology. We wait for the sorrow. We wait for the person to feel bad. We wait for the guilt. But what we see in this moment is Jesus modeling what he talks about in Matthew chapter 5, verse 24, where he says, if you're offering a gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave the gift at the altar and first go and be reconciled. He says, man, before I go about my business, I got some people that I need to reconcile with. I got some people that I need to take some steps with. We can make the first move. Secondly, we can meet them where they are. Verse 21 says, afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples. Notice that word again. Sometimes reconciliation takes multiple attempts. Sometimes we have to keep going back and keep having conversations. And it says he met them by the Sea of Galilee. They had gone back to their own lives and he meets them where they are. And then finally, I love this moment when he restores Peter, who denied him 3 times. In verse 15, it says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And when it comes to reconciliation, we can make the first move. We can meet people where they are, and then we can lead with questions, not accusations. What a beautiful way Jesus leads into this conversation. He could have said hey, you denied me. Look, I told you this was gonna happen. That's how a lot of our conversations go. I told you were gonna do this and you did this. You lived down to my expectations for you. I told you were gonna deny me. You denied me. You owe me an apology. No, he goes to him and he says, hey, Peter, do you love me? Because if we love each other, this is a foundation that we can build on. If we love each other, we can work out how we're gonna move forward. We can work out the next steps of how we're gonna reconcile this relationship. But do you love me? We can lead with questions and not accusations. He had the hard conversation and modeled that hard conversations don't have to be confrontational to reconcile, to be restorative. And I love these moments and the way he moves them into reconciliation with him, because God gives us relationships to grow us, to bless us, and to fortify our faith. He gives us relationships that are worth fighting for. We got to be people that are willing to address issues and catch the little foxes and not allow them to gnaw on the roots of our relationships. Would you bow your heads with me this morning?